You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. This month we are going to be covering some deep and difficult topics, talking about the ways that whiteness is associated with goth, talking about tokenism and colorism in the scene. We'll be discussing commodity racism, neoliberalism, and asking if goth is political. What does that mean? What values align with a goth ethos or ideology or identity? And how does that look in our communities and our spaces and our music? So there's a lot here, more that could be covered in a single episode. However, I believe our guests are up to the task and more than qualified to discuss this issue. So without further ado, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Our guests this month are from across the US and involved in the goth scene in a variety of different ways, but I will let them share that with you. So, Aimee, why don't we start with you? Can you please let us know how you got into goth initially and how you are involved in your local goth community?
So I'm Aimee, and I'm an admin at Hext Miami, and I have been for almost a decade. We do everything that I think a concierge does when you're dropping into our subtropical hell. And I got into goth because I was in a school that had German exchange students, and they were obsessed with Rammstein.
Okay.
And I didn't know what that was, and started picking up German for that. And from there, I just met peers that, loved the March Violets and bands of that ilk, and I was more attracted to that. But that's the story, and I'm here. I don't know what else to say about myself.
That's pretty good, though. We don't get many March Violet name drops.
That's one of my favorite bands. I'm so happy.
Really?
That's one of my favorite
snap,
bands.
snap. It's just a weird introduction because I tell people and they're like, "Whoa, that's something," right? Like most people say, "Oh, Bauhaus," but that wasn't my first introduction at all. And that was in middle school. It's very bizarre. So imagine I go into high school and like all this goth metal starts popping up and becoming popular, and people in like lovely flowy outfits and corsets, and I'm like, what do you listen to? And I expect to hear something like Susie, and they're just like, oh, Cradle of Filth.
Yeah.
I'm not really into this kind of goth. Bye.
It was that era, the mall goth, when everyone was
I'm about
listening
that
to that metal
goth,
stuff.
though, the aesthetic.
Yeah. Well, I remember a lot of the trip pants would go with like Slipknot shirts and Cradle of Filth shirts and Manson
maybe
shirts.
Not
and
that
stuff.
part.
Yeah. Ellen, what about you? How did you get into goth? Where's your local scene? If you want to share your Etsy shop, that kind of thing.
I don't know. It's like hard to say because it was never like there was this one thing that made me get into goth. It was like I was always interested in like dark, creepy stuff. Like I started drawing at a young age, and I like drawing horror arts. I started reading. There was this manga called Bison Goth that was like, it wasn't marketed as a gothic manga, but I feel like it had goth vibes because like the fashion and stuff. And then gradually over time, as I started learning more about the music and the art and everything, I started getting more and more involved. But I don't really have I saw this person dressed really cool and I asked them about their outfit, or someone introduced me to goth music, and now this is what I like. It was just like, it was more so like a gradual thing. I feel like a lot of things I liked before I knew what goth was, I already liked them. And once I started learning more about goth, it just kind of tied in a lot of things I already enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people experience that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And then do you want to tell us where people can find, like, you know, Rain's Wonderland and that kind of thing?
You can find it on Etsy. So just like etsy.com/shop/Rain's Wonderland.
Excellent. I'll link that in the show notes as well.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Sienna. Okay, so I didn't start with goth itself. I've always listened to rock and metal, and actually I was very much into grunge when I was little. Like, I'm talking like 11, 12, because that's what I heard my mom listening to and my cousins. And like the first CD I was ever gifted was Stone Temple Pilots, and from there I just kept wanting something darker. Like, I was like, okay, so I dipped into metal, and then from there I found goth and punk, and really I had always liked alternative music and liked exploring different genres, and I just kind of discovered it by just kind of searching out more alternative genres. So it wasn't just jumping right into goth, it was kind of just through other alternative genres. But yeah, it definitely hit me, though. I would say, like, when I was like 13 or 14, I just full on, like, that's all I wanted was just goth music at that point.
And where do you have any social media you want to send people to or anything like that?
Yeah, so my main Instagram is just sienna.bat, and that's what I'm most active on.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I also used to be involved with Real Punk Radio. I'm in Metro Detroit, but we kind of have people all over the place. And I used to be involved with that before COVID happened, and I used to interview different bands around here, like Metro Detroit area, also like Port Huron. But I just haven't as much, and I haven't been as active since the whole pandemic. So, but I'm going to try to dip back into that.
Yeah, things are getting started back up again. I know our first night is happening in July.
Well, I think technically they're doing something at the Underground Lounge this weekend, but yeah, Nocturna is July.
A couple weeks ago, they did a Witch House night in Chicago as well. So maybe not the first goth night, but yeah, Nocturna.
Yeah, they've had stuff going on here too, especially Detroit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm going to start going out again, but I'm kind of watching how bad this new Delta variant is going to be. See if they shut everything down again. You know?
Yeah,
I'm definitely nervous.
I'll probably be sticking with a mask, but I'll probably go out.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Yeah. There's a lot of things I want to talk about, and there's a number of different directions this could go in, but I wanted to try and start by providing some kind of grounding and context between goth subculture and social action, political action, and the experience of the community. So maybe we can start by sharing how we feel goth is, or maybe should be, an anti-racist space, and how any sort of philosophical or political framework fits into that. Well, like, essentially, I'm trying to phrase, is goth political, or why is that relevant, in a different way, you know? But however you want to take that.
I feel like it is because it evolved from the punk music industry, and like that was very political.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say that it's always been political. There are a lot of people that try to say, "Oh, don't bring politics into it," but it's always been political, and goth is directly from punk, so there's no way you can avoid that. And it definitely should not be a space for any sort of racism. It makes me sick when I see that kind of stuff always find a way into different alternative communities in some way, when our spaces were never made for those kind of people.
Yeah.
I think it's an a priori fallacy to think that because goth does not want to concern itself with political movements, that its actions cannot be political. The choices that we make as a community reflect our values.
Right.
As such, we have to be cognizant of how the media and outside groups will look at us, what lenses they're they're placing over us. And some examples that I can cite are, for example, Sophie Lancaster or Marilyn Manson, who is not goth himself, but has been, thrown into that box of creepy people that would be lumped in with this subculture. And how based on perception, we're a collective and that's subject to policy.
Yeah. Trey, do you want to? I've kind of a long-winded.
Sure, I can jump in before your long-winded thought. Yeah, I think I kind of agree with what you're saying there, that, the perception of what is and is not political is part of the misunderstanding that leads to so many people being so adamant against it. A lot of people, well, one, especially in America, being quote unquote political has been viewed as either a boomer thing or just has negative connotations. It's been kind of demonized by society as being political. And it seems to be boiled down to, oh, you're out there protesting and you're out there rioting, or you're boring everybody at the party with policy points and telling them to vote and stuff like that. And while that is a form of political action, it's not the extent of politics. Yeah. It's not the entire extent of politics. There's plenty of politics, which, as Aimee said, is just, acting your values in public and trying to normalize said values is an attempt to change the norms of the public, which is politics, is political. It's not necessarily the active political where you're putting people in office and getting laws passed, but it is an attempt to shift norms to make the world more comfortable to your ideals, and having that dialogue in action with the people around you as we, as a community, try to develop how to live as a community.
Right. Yeah, that's sort of that, the personal is political, as I think her name was Hansish initially said that in the, I don't remember when it was, 50s or 60s. Basically, she was saying that, like, as a woman, she experiences discrimination and sexism, and that's not because of a personal problem. It's an effect of systemic patriarchy. So existing as a woman is a political issue because of how that works.
Yeah, once you get into the underprivileged races, genders, sexes, whatever, you get people that can't even, they're not given the liberty to decide whether they can be political or not. They are, it's thrust upon them simply by prejudice and expectations and that they might struggle against.
Yeah.
I don't have a choice in being political because my existence is political.
Yeah. And I would say that what's interesting about, and I don't know if we're going to talk about this just yet, but what's interesting about being in Miami is that because we are a community that's comprised of what would be outside of Miami minorities, I feel that there's almost this responsibility to be able to speak some of the things that, say, like Latinx folks outside of here that aren't in that kind of privilege cannot, right? Speaking of not having like the opportunity to make your values known.
Yeah.
Not that I'm saying that I would speak for an entire community, but I'm saying that concerns. Yeah.
I think everyone hit on a lot of the, major points, right? Talking about how goth shares spaces with minority groups and queer groups. They share members between like activist groups as well. You mentioned Sophie. That's direct political action. So we don't even have to really, I know on previous episodes, I've sort of talked about the broader, like, ontological, nature of being a agent embedded in the world, and why that is inherently a form of political, enactment or semiosis. But like, we don't even have to go there. What I wanted to talk about was music specifically, because a lot of the current understandings and definitions people talk about these days of goth is grounded in music. So I wanted to get a few examples of how that music has been not just romantic and poetic and theatrical and talking about like occultism and horror stories and things like that, but also talking about social justice. You know, and actually, Ellen, to your point, we could go back and talk about punk, right? Because you had, and even post-punk, you had like the pop group is a great example, Gang of Four. It was all very political. A lot of it was based in leftism. And but some people are going to say like, well, that's not goth because they're not goth bands or whatever. So I wanted to grab a few examples. So
you could bring in Susie and Sisters as well as for explicitly political bands.
Well, yeah. So for Sisters, right, specific examples would be Dominion, which is, everybody like brings that song up, but Eldritch said that song was an anti-American diatribe flavored by the Chernobyl disaster, but also all of Vision Thing. Mm-hmm. That album was a response to George Bush. Sebastian by Sex Gang Children. I pulled up this interview. The interviewer asked Andy Sex Gang, quote, "Is this a political anthem? It's an anthem to me, speaking the truth on politics and religion." And Andy said, "You're absolutely right. It's an intensely anti-religious and politically conscious song. I usually endeavor to drape my lyrics with a veil of ambiguity, as I believe it important to allow the listener to discover their own interpretation. However, Sebastian is and had to be less ambiguous." Killing Joke is another obvious example. Their self-titled album was very political, just from the cover photo, which was a photo of rioters escaping CS gas clouds during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. That whole album is very political. Ignore the Machine by Alien Sex Fiend was about the ways war fueled by capitalistic greed caused widespread harm. In the liner notes of Young Limbs and Numb Hymns, the Batcave Club was described as an iconoclast, which is something that attacks cherished beliefs or institutions, and it was also described as a challenge to the false idol of London, which seems like a pretty socio-political statement. So we have that. There's just a few because I didn't want to sit here and talk forever, but there's some classic examples, but we can also reference like interviews we've done on this podcast. So Dusty of Vision Video, Edward of Nervous Gender, Charlotte of Nox Novacula, Adria of Tears of the Dying, for the Dying, sorry, William Faith and Scary Lady Sarah of the Bellwether Syndicate, Danny of Dist. They have all at one point talked about the relevance of activism to their music and their personal lives. And then just you look at the music that's coming out today, where like Secret Shame talks about anarchistic ideals in their music. Otzi and Mystic Priestess and Bastet are three bands I love, and they talk about feminist and queer rights in their song. Virgin and Veil mixes sex with leftist politics. Die of All Strain just did an interview in Procession magazine, and they said they were talking about how the patriarchal neoliberalism of Latin America influences their music. So you can really just kind of throw a rock and hit a goth band these days that has said something political. So I think that was the point I wanted to make, because I've talked about social issues, and I wanted to say something about music. And that's not to say that no one is making music about love and loss and fantasy and that kind of thing. But the point I'm trying to make is that I think goth music is multidimensional, and I don't think you can say that goth music is apolitical in any
100% agree.
Anyway. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to note, though it's kind of I guess a little bit of a spoiler for our book review episode, Danny.
Oh, I think these two issues dovetail. Yeah,
they do. But one thing that I thought was interesting was their discussion in one of the early chapters about the butting heads between the darks and the punks, and how the punks had a very concrete view in Milan, in Italy, about in order to be a part of this subculture, you had to be this sort of rabid activist, and you had to only like these bands that are very political and only like these things that are very, very political. And the people who were not into that, but were still in the same spaces, sharing the same squats, but weren't necessarily as into that, and we're getting into this newer post-punk dark scene, as they called it in Italy. There's a lot of contention there because they were viewed as posers by the hardcore punks.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is, to a degree, an argument can be made that goth backed away a little bit from politics. It's not quite as rabidly political as, say, the origins in punk, but I think the argument to say that they completely removed it or eschew it entirely is completely false. But it is interesting that there was a bit of a split there, and some of that has to do with this sort of idea of the purity of what is and is not political. Mm-hmm. That people get a little bit set in their ways. And then another thing I know, I think it was either it might have been on your Facebook, Danny, or maybe as a YouTube comment section for one of our videos, there was a discussion or a debate about being political in goth. And one of the people that was very adamant against it had this idea that politics was choosing a side between liberal and conservative. And that's basically it, is if you
choose neither.
You do political and you say goth is interested in social justice, in welcoming, minority groups, then goth is liberal, and you have to be into abortion, and you have to be into, you have to basically have this entire.
I'm big into abortion. Yeah,
I know. But you have to take one side whole hog in order to accept any of this. When first off, the binary political system is really a very American thing, and is a plague on our country, frankly, because you can agree with bits of conservative and bits of liberal ideologies and mix and match, and you can still be, in the subculture and in the scene. There are plenty of arguments and things that we can discuss in this episode about lines that we can't cross, things that are inherent in the goth ideology that may make aspects of it lean one way or another. But other than that, it doesn't mean you have to be a right-wing fanatic or a left-wing fanatic all in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, per your abortion or interest in abortion, I'm all for the baby placenta intake. But anyway, also interestingly enough, I had a to your point, Trey, about the I guess the segmentation, political segmentation between punk and goth. I kind of had a similar moment in my life where I had for a time when Cradle of Filth, for example, started to be a big thing. Not knocking them, I totally dig. but when all of these like new metal bands started coming up, and I was frustrated because I couldn't find any music that I could call my own or that I was interested in. I started delving into punk because that was what my peers were listening to, and in that time, I felt especially interested in world affairs, right? And then eventually, I started also kind of going the other way of the pendulum, right? And thinking of my own world and like my internal world, and slowly receding back into the I guess the catacombs and cobwebs, and so it just just a parallel of funny history and me.
No, I think that's a good point, and I kind of want to elaborate on this a little later, but I do think there is, when you're talking about is goth political, I think the answer is yes, but then the second question is in what ways? And I think that you can make arguments for both neoliberalism in goth having roots in that, and also in some Marxism and leftism, which I know those two things aren't compatible, but maybe we can talk about that a little later.
Plenty of anarchism too.
Yeah.
Was not, we didn't escape that from punk completely.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on a little bit here and talk about the ways that systemic racism and bigotry seep into our community, because I don't think that when you're talking about goth identity, however you want to define that, that expression of self still exists in and is influenced by broader culture. So I wanted to ask, what are the ways that you see things like white privilege or microaggressions or systemic bigotry having an influence on the community?
If no one starts, I will.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, awesome. So I can only speak for my community, though I have traveled quite a bit. And I've had experiences all over the world. I will say this: Miami is unique in that there has been historically an obsession with white culture, right? So we have this rich Latin American, I guess, link. We are a Pan-American city. If I want to, I can fly over to the DR, which is where my family is from, and I'm a citizen of the Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so that plus the language being pervasive, here, or it makes it very accessible for you to listen to a band from Chile, to listen to a band from anywhere, like Colombia. We have such a huge population of Colombians here. And yet, what do you hear in the clubs? Up until recently, all you heard in terms of exports, or rather imports, right, were German bands, maybe English bands. So I don't know if this is because so many of us are second or first gen and we're just trying to assimilate here, or as our parents have told us to.
Yeah.
But yeah, this newfound interest in Latin American goth music has only been a push that has happened really because of white DJs. I'm not going to lie to you. That sounds awful. We should be advocating for our own, right? And I mean, and this isn't everyone, obviously. Some of the newer promoters in our scene, some of the younger folks are not like this. My partner Shirl is Mexican. My partner Shirl in Hex Miami, not like a romantic partner. And she's been trying to push bands like Bloodstream and Blue Anxiety for a fairly long time, and Miami's ears just haven't been ready. And there's also obviously that element of reticence that people have when they hear something new. But in general, it's just been this I don't know, people have been trying to learn German, to understand the music there. And I'm like, why? There's so much going on in Mexico. There's so much going on, in Puerto Rico. We have a musician, for example, Lost Era. He lives right here. Do you think he's ever played in Miami? No. Why? We have a DJ named DJ Relámpago, which means lightning son. And that's not a gendered, gendered toward anyone. I'm just saying, just, snap. And DJ Relámpago plays things that, nobody has ever heard of in terms of dark wave, in terms of post-punk that's just emerging in South America. We never hear that stuff except for her, but she doesn't get booked as often. So it's been sad, right? That and I'm gonna ramble a little bit more, but we do have a largely Cuban community here, which has had, because of all of the waves that have come in from different periods in Castro's I guess regime, have come from different socioeconomic circumstances, which inform the way in which they view their place as Americans, if you will. And so they're very much conservative. If they come from that first gen that happened to have had all their assets seized because they were rich, right? Or needed to, and then second gen, they came from El Mariel maybe. And the Mariel is like when all of the undesirables were sent off over here. So maybe people who had been criminals, who had been homosexuals. So a very different kind of, I guess, Cuban diaspora here at that period. And that really has, I think, marked our politics. And I would say we're like 46, like 50 something in terms of like having divisions having like conservative versus like leftist folks in our scene. So that also gives you like a diversity of gives you diversity in terms of what kind of music that will come down here and what people will accept.
Yeah,
I think the acceptance is a big key there, because there's definitely a representational issue, and that's, I think, a lot of the core of it, is that because these bands or certain ethnicities or certain ways of being haven't been historically represented within the community, it's harder for that to break in, because when they do come in, for whatever reason, because they're outside of the norm, there's a little bit of a tension there. As an outsider in somewhat insular community, it's hard to get outsiders to break in. And then I know, speaking, from when I was a DJ and when I've talked to other DJs about their experience trying to just break any new music, even, English American new music, is really hard, because a lot of club patrons just want to hear the same old songs from whatever their particular club heyday was, whether it was the 80s or whether it was the 90s. They want to keep hearing those same songs that they love. And when you play something new, the floor just sort of evaporates. And that makes it hard to bring in anything new. And since a lot of the stuff coming from the non-traditional, European and American hotspots of classic goth, that's all something new. And having a language barrier makes it even harder, despite what you said about people learning German, because, well, that's okay, it's German. But yeah, that language barrier isn't helping.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that comes down to the responsibility of the DJs. I forget who it was that said it, but one of the hosts on We Have a Technical, when talking about, they had an episode about pet peeves about DJing or something like that. Mm-hmm. And he had said that he thinks it's the responsibility of the DJ to kill the floor every so often, because if it's just constantly filled, you're probably doing something wrong.
Yep, I viewed that as a point of pride when I DJ'd. Is every once in a while I wanted to play something just totally off the wall. And also I tried to do a little bit of the switcheroo too, where it's something that's new but sounds like something else. So I'll play the favorite song and then follow it or precede it with something that was similar but new. Mm-hmm. I'd kind of go both ways.
Yeah. So Sienna or Ellen, do either of you have thoughts on? I'm sorry, Aimee, I didn't mean to interrupt you if you were going to say something.
No. I think you should follow up. I do have thoughts, but I wanted to ask a question. So go ahead.
Yeah. Did either of you two have thoughts on ways you've seen or thought of, bigotry of some kind seeping into the community?
A lot of it is not just like in the community. It's because there's such a lack of representation, especially in the media, that if you're a person of color, especially if you're Black like me, if you're someone who is goth or alternative, people often say like you're trying to be white, and it's like, how am I trying to be white when a lot of the things within the goth subculture, a lot of the things within rock culture were created by Black people. And a lot of times it's coming from people who appropriate everything from every other culture and incorporate it into their goth aesthetic and call it alternative. They have stretched ears, they have scarification, piercing, tattoos, septum rings, mohawks. They tease their hair.
Yeah.
They're wearing huge eyeliner, Black lipstick, Black nail polish. A lot of those things come from Africa. A lot of those things come from indigenous cultures and beliefs. A lot of them are walking around with fake locks.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's just like, it's ironic that people would accuse me of trying to be white for being interested in the subculture when like a lot of that stuff comes from Black culture that people have just kind of swept under the rug and forgot about. And when it comes to the community, I've faced lots of microaggressions, like mostly online. A lot of it hasn't been in person. Like people that are regulars at the places that I would attend were never like that. But usually if I come in contact with like an outsider or somebody that isn't really from around the area or somebody that I'm not mutuals with, I always have to deal with one form or another of a microaggression of some kind.
Yeah, I definitely agree too. I hate comments like that. It's always the same people who, like you were saying, take from our different cultures. I've had people say things about my look, or one time I had a guy coming for me about my piercings when the piercings I have are traditional to the Mexica people, my tribe.
Ooh.
And it's like, we started this, so I don't want anybody to come for me and tell me that I'm trying to be something when we're the ones that have always had these practices and these things. I'm not trying to be anybody but myself.
Exactly.
And going back of what we were saying earlier about like what I see a lot is people of color in goth music or alternative music in general are not talked about. Like I see, like, for example, She Wants Revenge. A lot of people, I've seen this argument where people don't even want to claim them as goth. And the lead singer is Black. And I know that if I have a feeling that if he was white, that there wouldn't even be a question or argument. But I see a lot of that, or a lot of other really great goth bands. I just never hear anyone talking about them, like Oh Children or Light Asylum, these great bands. Glorious Din was a really good band that I know. Who talks about Glorious Din?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just, they need to be talked about more, and it makes me sad that we just kind of get brushed under the rug.
Yeah. And then when O Candy said something similar, everybody jumped on him for it. Yeah, and I think a lot of, I guess I've kind of said this before, but I think a lot of that, historically, some of the problem has been because goths think of themselves as outsiders already, and so then white goths use that as a way to deflect examining any kind of internalized racism or sexism or ableism or anything like that.
Right. There's always the, I can't be that because I've been,
yeah,
picked on, I've been discriminated against, so I can't be discriminatory. When it just never works that way.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of white goths mistake being bullied and harassed for their appearance for like actual oppression that people of color face, and they think it's comparable or that it cancels it out.
Yeah, there's a way it can help develop a sense of empathy about it if you've experienced something like that before, being profiled for your look. But the massive difference is that your look as a white individual is a choice, and you can take off that look and masquerade as something maybe you're not, but not get the oppression. And you can't do that if that look is just part of your physical body.
Yeah.
Well, related to this then is the subject of cultural associations with whiteness and goth. And the example that I put in the notes was the skin bleaching video that It's Black Friday did, with not a single word spoken about goth not being white. She has other videos where she emphasizes pale skin with no context given to people of color in the scene, even after having been called out multiple times over the years for those videos. She's never taken them down. So maybe we can talk about why that's a problem and ways that whiteness is associated with goth.
I feel like it's a problem because when I was first getting into makeup and I was trying to find like goth makeup stuff, literally every goth makeup tutorial on the internet is like, paint your face white, use extra foundation, put some more on, here's some translucent powder, go to the Halloween store and put on some more white paint, and then just paint your eyes black. Like literally every makeup tutorial was like that. And I'm like, dude, what the fuck? I'm not doing that.
Oh, I feel you. Like I couldn't find anything that was for my skin color. I'd like look up like tutorials, and I'd have to like look up people who are outside of this community who could like tailor to my skin.
Yeah.
So
I had to follow like Black makeup artists and watch them do makeup looks that I don't really like in order to actually learn about makeup. That's like catered toward me and my skin. And then I started to find more people that were like people of color, like Black people doing goth makeup looks, but they kind of would follow the same trend. They would be like, first you're gonna get a foundation that's like 4 shades layered in you. Oh my gosh, can you just not?
Yeah.
I am not trying to look ashy.
There's been a problem in a lot of countries about the status of different shades of skin, including Africa and Asia, both South and Northern Asia. Whereas a lot of lighter skinned folks of the region are given some extra status, and that's certainly a problem in those cultures. And we're kind of, it's a bit of a holdover from colonialism, since most of those cultures were under white control for at least some time in our history of colonial powers. And because we were in control, we were viewed as the high status individuals. And so emulating that in either physical appearance or simply demeanor, if you want to get into the and the idea of the slaves who were in the house versus the slaves who were in the field, and the status there and the difference of how they were supposed to act to maintain that role. There's been a lot of problems historically just across the board.
Yeah, also in the media.
And that's not just exclusive to those places either. It's also very much so in Latin America. Like Mexico, you get told to don't go outside for too long. You don't want to get more brown, or being seen as indigenous is bad. Like, you don't want to be called like Indio is an insult. And there's definitely colorism there. Lighter has always been more beautiful because of the Spanish colonizers, and it's everywhere. It's been everywhere where there's been colonization, and it's just really sad how it's an insult and it's not pretty to people. To this day, it's still an issue.
And how it's been so ingrained in even people who are indigenous to the area at this point. It's just, they don't even think about it anymore. It's just it's an automatic knee-jerk response to seeing a lighter skin tone and aspiring to it.
Yeah. So oh, go on.
No, I was just saying, like, it gives you more opportunities worldwide, in America, in South America, and Mexico. It's a real big problem throughout Asia. You only see the whiter skin versions of those people represented in the media, and people feel like if they have lighter skin, that they could have a shot at being on TV, or they can be an actress, or they can meet that beauty standard. People are dying with skin bleaching creams that are killing them. It's literally in everything.
I remember just going around like stores and stuff, and just wondering why there was no brown people in advertisements. Why am I not seeing, like, Mexico is so brown, why is there nobody brown in these advertisements? Why am I not seeing brown representation? And it's just so frustrating. And I would bring it up, and people would just be like, oh, like, get mad at me for bringing it up. But we should be able to see our people around, or see, like, if I'm surrounded by brown people, why is there no brown people on advertisements or on TV? Why is that?
It might be that Miami is part of the Bermuda Triangle, but we have a lot of interesting opinions about that. So with regards to skin lightening, not a thing here, but wearing ghostly pallor has been a thing. Not so much in recent times, unless you're like talking about trad goth folk, but with I would say like in the 90s, that was huge. More so for the interest in having a ghostly pallor and looking dead in your own way than trying to be ashy. But I also recognize, obviously, as someone who had biracial parents, and all my fam, because I'm Dominican, is like it's like I would say 70% is Black. There is a phrase that you do hear still, and it happens even outside of Dominican culture, mejorando la raza, which means bettering the race by marrying whiter folk. So you don't have to lighten your skin, you just have to marry whiter. And white is power, as everybody's already said.
Yeah, they don't have the right to pillage you anymore if they convince you that if you marry white, you can have a whiter child and you fetishize mixed kids.
Yeah, and I mean, I am born of that desire for whiteness. So my mom, she's got a bulbous nose because her mom is Black. My grandma's Black, right? But she has white skin, pallor of the moon. My dad is indigenous, but also more white adjacent. And yeah, I came out like this, kind of like a little bit like a cream coffee. But yeah, all that stuff is internalized, and in the way that you interact with people in the scene, like sometimes you don't even think about it. But whiter is that aspiration, is that goal.
And I think that's why I brought up why I wanted to use that Black Friday video as an example, because, well, I mean, it's egregious, first of all, because she's the most popular goth YouTuber. So like you were saying, Ellen, that's what you look up videos, that's what you find. But I think it also illustrates a couple things where we have white privilege playing into that, because as a white person, you're kind of raised to think that your opinion always matters all the time, and you don't have to view other people's life experiences or examine your own reasons for believing certain things. It's this kind of, I think it's called ontological expansion, basically the idea that white people feel like they have the right to talk about or participate in any topic, and nothing is off limits, nothing is closed, and you can speak as an authority because that's how you've been socialized to think how your opinion matters and all the time. It's also, like you were saying, Ellen, that sort of, I guess, commodity racism. The problem with this is that, at least from what I read, some of the sources I was reading were saying that the skin lightening practice was mostly popularized by Victorians who would obsess over being as white as possible because it was associated with purity. So that's where those products started to come from. And like you said, Ellen, that led to a history of colorism for people destroying their skin and contracting diseases. And you can see it's not a historical thing, right? Everyone gave examples. There's also the racial doll test, where you can go and watch these videos of kids being shown, black and white kids being shown black and white dolls, and then pointing at the black doll and talking about how it's ugly and it's scarier and it's heartbreaking. But this is a result of that colonialism. And so that's not to say that Black Friday's intent was to perpetuate colorism, but the problem is when you don't have to examine that internalized racism and that culture, that systemic culture around us that encourages that kind of thing, you just end up perpetuating these issues specifically within our community. And I know, like, I've talked about this before, and I've had people just kind of roll their eyes at it and say that I'm overreacting a bit, like other white people. But like in a practical sense, if you just look at the scene, you can clearly see that paleness is associated with being more goth. Some people,
as a counterpoint, though, I would ask you, how can somebody like Black Friday, really speak for anything other than her own experience? Because otherwise, would she be speaking for me? Right? Is she going to bring someone and tokenize them and be like, oh, sup, look, Sienna's my friend.
Right.
And she's brown. Hey. So how does she correct something like that? We all love to complain, but I would love to hear, like, and I know this is getting a little bit ahead, but like, I would love to hear how somebody can, be like, be respectful, basically, of the space that they have and share the mic.
Just have like a little PSA, like a disclaimer. You know, I watch YouTubers all the time talk about all kinds of things, not just off YouTube, but you know, lots of other things. Like I watch a lot of true crime content, or you know, I watch other makeup content, or where people will make jokes about certain things, or they will have a tutorial and they say, hey, you know, in all seriousness, da da da, and they would like link resources and stuff to learn more about something.
Yeah, I think platforming other YouTubers is a great way of doing that. Saying, oh, by the way, I have
That's exactly what I was
white
saying.
skin tone, so I do this. But if you have darker skin tones, whether it's a little bit bronze from tanning, or it's brown from heritage, or it's black, here's some other YouTubers who do makeup in that style that will help you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, contextualizing it. And also, I mean, to your point, Aimee, I think it is important to know when to say this. I can't speak for this cultural experience or for these people because it's outside of, you know, that's not my place. And in that sense, I don't think there's any justification for that skin bleaching video to exist. I don't think it should have been made. And I think when people called her out about it in the comments, that when Trey, that article you shared with me that called out that video, that it shouldn't be on the internet anymore. I mean, it shouldn't have been made in the first place. I don't think there's any way you can contextualize that video to give context to colorism and the history of skin lightening, and to say that that pale skin it's, you know, some people say like it's not about being pale, it's about looking dead. So for whatever that is for your skin type, you know, whatever, monochromatic, that kind of thing. But I don't think there's any way you can have that context in that video. So yeah, I don't think it should exist.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That is kind of irresponsible, considering that content like hers has a huge audience of mostly children and young adults. So it's like influencing a whole other generation. And it's also influencing people who aren't goth or interested in subculture, but maybe their kids are getting into it, or maybe somebody they know is, and they're trying to figure out what it's all about, and they do a Google search and they find videos like Black Friday or Dora Bat Brad or someone like that. And if this is, you know, the face of the goth community on like a huge platform, and they don't think to look for smaller creators to try and get a more varied opinion, or they don't think to check out like other opinions or anything, if they don't know anyone in the culture to ask personally, and they don't know where to find like smaller content creators or anything like that, then like it's very problematic, and it's immature, and it's just so like irresponsible. And there's so many things I don't like about Black Friday. I used to enjoy her content when she first started out, but over time I just noticed a bunch of red flags. And recently with her kind of like praising what's his name?
Prince Philip.
Something that's like her grandpa or whatever. Like what?
I wanted to add earlier that just like Adora, she was also asked to speak on Black Lives Matter, and she said, correct me if I'm wrong, she said she was bullied into doing that, and both of them both of them, even Adora, were saying just they want to avoid topics like that. So even with the skin lightening video, I don't think, from what I've seen, she doesn't have good intent. She doesn't care because it doesn't affect her. She's not Black, she's not brown. So she has this platform and she'll put those things out there because she doesn't care. And when it comes to talk about those kind of topics, it's uncomfortable for her because she doesn't want to have to get involved because it doesn't apply to her. So she tries to make it seem like she's being forced to talk into these things or pressured into it, because for them as white people, it's uncomfortable to bring it up. And I saw the same thing with Adora when she tried to speak on it and then said all lives matter, and you know, they don't know how to go about it, and they try to say that it doesn't affect them, so they're from other countries, it doesn't really affect them, but that just shows their privilege even more. Like they don't care to think about other people.
Yeah,
I do see those. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I never really thought that. I wasn't really looking to Adora or Black Friday to speak about those issues, to be honest, especially not Adora. There are so many pictures of her on the internet, like at the Auschwitz camps, doing a whole bunch of anti-Semitic things and being completely careless. There's a picture of her in a black shirt, and it says, like, I'm a Black girl. Like, she has a long list of things about her that are so problematic. Like, I really wasn't looking to her to say anything about Black Lives Matter or anything. Like,
right. But it's unfortunate that these people are still the face of goth for many. Like, it shouldn't be this way. I get tired of it.
Yeah, it is kind of annoying.
I see a lot of young following still, and that's the issue, because they're learning from the wrong people.
Yeah.
Rewinding a little bit, talking about skin lightening or even using foundation to make your skin appear whiter. I remember that when I came back to the scene, circa 2009-8, I made a point to not be and like to not use anything to lighten my skin, because I said this is how I was born, and this should be admissible. This should be a face that you are going to recognize. Like I refuse. I've never done it.
Right.
And this was unpopular at the time, and because German bands were still around, that whole like aesthetic.
Yeah.
But I don't care.
I've always been that way too, actually. Like, my mom, when I first started dressing this way, she was like, don't you use that foundation to make your skin white? And I was like, don't worry, I wasn't planning on it. I'm proud to be brown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many aspects of Latin American culture that are macabre, that, I mean, you're borrowing from me. Get the fuck out. Like, you're wearing velos, my best friend's Puerto Rican. His like grandmother, I believe, or his great grandmother wore all black when their spouse died, wore a black veil for years, because that's part of their mourning process, right? In PR, or back then. So I don't have anything to take from you. Like,
yeah. It's like your culture is so rich and so many elements, and so many things have been appropriated and like taken out of context, that like, why would you even have to join this to like pretend to be white? That's so absurd to me.
Yeah, it's like the same people who say we're stealing are the same ones who will try to pretend that they're dressing up as somebody on the day like Dia de Muertos. Like they wear, they call it sugar skulls. They call it sugar skulls. You have all those costumes, and they try to be all spooky like that, and then completely ignore the fact that yes, our cultures have elements like that with death. It's very much embedded. So we're not taking anything whatsoever.
Exactly. And then they call it Mexican Halloween. So it's like they don't even try and learn what the holiday is, the history behind it, what it means to people, or like the celebrations around why it's a thing.
No, and that's a very colonizer thing, is just taking something and completely like spinning it into what they want it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go on.
I was just going to say, as a colonizer, that the general habit is to take something that is native to the population you're colonizing and then trying to associate as closely as possible with something in your own culture, both to help you understand it, but more importantly, to help kind of try to ingrain that native population into your culture to aid in the colonial process.
And they want it to appeal more to white people.
Going back to like spooky elements of our own cultures, something that I like to point out is Miami. We have paleras, we have witches here. We have people who throw the bones as opposed to the runes, right? And to tell your fortunes. We go out to the beaches and, sing for our dead. So what I guess I'm saying, there's so much beauty in there, and I wish I could, take out a sea urchin and for it to be as universal as a bat to the goth community. Yeah. That's not to speak of racism, so I'm sorry. I know this is a tangent, but I'm just saying there's a lot of beautiful things in our cultures that deserve that kind of visibility.
No,
well.
I mean, I think that's part of it, and bigotry in general, and then just the sort of subcultural discourse around what is it that is goth then, and how do we define those traits without being appropriative and but also creating new art. And I kind of want to think through the ways that we value certain things and create these hierarchies. I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that, or even just to speak to bigotry outside of racism, sort of, able-bodied privilege or straight privilege, or ways that manifests.
I mean, I'd like to just concur with you, or rather expand on the point of who makes these value systems, right? Who decides, like, oh, this is cool, right? As I had said earlier, with regards to the scene in Miami picking up on Latin American artists, this was like largely a push by white people here. I know that's crazy, but it's the truth. And in so many ways, even though they are the minority population, they're at the forefront of pushing these things. And while I think that's wonderful because of what Trey was saying about incorporating, I guess, the culture of the of the colonizers, with the colonized. Not that I'm saying colonialism is good, but just that these cultures get to mesh, I think is a lovely opportunity. But who are the people making this value system?
Yeah, what's the power dynamic?
That's something that always exactly why is it like this? Can we make it so that everyone's voice is elevated? Probably not. Okay, spoiler. But just saying, I want to be a little bit utopian about this.
Yeah.
Let me dream.
Well, yeah, like you're saying, I mean, one of the most important things has to be making sure we're continuing, or that we are even in the first place, making voices that aren't white have equal space, equal ground in our spaces, so that when we are setting those guidelines for what is and isn't goth, there's more of an equity-based discourse. And, the thing that I worry about is when we start to say that, when you think about who is it that merits reward, like social capital, respect in the scene, I worry that's based in privileged conceptions of what has value, like the idea that goths with the biggest record collection deserve more respect, or if you have winkle pickers instead of tennis shoes, you're a better goth, or if you can go out to the club or an event every night, you're higher up there in the hierarchy. So those are, you have money, you have an able body, there's a class distinction there. You can obtain the products that the community places value on. It's going to be easier for you. If you're in even things like, if you're really knowledgeable about music, that takes labor to learn, and labor takes time. And so if you're working 40 hours or more a week, or you're disabled, or you live in poverty, you maybe don't have that time to memorize music history and discographies and obscure bands from the 80s. Maybe you just want to sit down and listen to music that you enjoy and turn your brain off.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm not saying that knowledge of the scene shouldn't have meaning, but we have to look at who's benefiting in these hierarchies. And obviously, if capitalism loves hierarchies and Marxism really critiques that kind of thing, because it's the Marxist critique, at least, is that these hierarchies drive the working class to compete against each other rather than uniting and working together against the people that are creating these divisions, that are creating these systems of oppression. So I think we need to develop this consciousness around issues like ableism and racism, and let people know that you are still an important part and an integral part of the community, regardless of your class status. And it kind of makes me think about the ways that we gatekeep goth, and if those really are beneficial. Yeah.
Something that I did think, I'm sorry, I talk so much.
No, go.
Y'all gotta stop me. Okay. Okay. Something that I did think about is, how you just said that some people just want to come in and turn their brains off. So while I think that so much of what we've discussed on race in this scene and classism is very much valid, and in other scenes, I would say, like, in Miami, people really do just want to turn off their brains. And I think this is just in general. This is not in this scene. And that,
yeah,
I don't think that we're examining those issues of privilege in that way, with the exception of course, of like some younger communities that I guess identify more on that trad goth side and that death rock end of the goth spectrum, if you will, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a welcome addition to the voices that have traditionally been white. And when I say white, I don't actually mean like literally white, because let's face it, my scene is 80% Hispanic. And so it's, when I say white, I mean white adjacent, white as power. Just to clarify earlier statements.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Sorry. I was just like saying that, like, I feel like in real life, not so much on the internet, the gatekeeping that tends to happen within the scene. I'm not saying it's not real or it doesn't exist, but like I haven't experienced that gatekeeping so much in real life. When I go to clubbing events or if I'm at a concert or whatever, people aren't asking me, oh, like, do you know, like, this band's, like, whole album history?
Yeah.
Do you know, like, the present his dad gave him in the 7th grade? You know, the name of his girlfriend in high school? Like, people aren't asking me weird shit like that in person as much when I am in, like, alternative or goth spaces. It's more so, like, as weird, entitled, like, sense of superiority that tends to happen more so on the internet, or if I am not in a goth or alternative space. Like, for an example, if I wore a band t-shirt and I went to the mall, if I were in Hot Topic or Spencer's or FYE when that was a thing, there would always be some middle-aged dude bro, like just middle-aged white dude that comes up to me and is like asking me a million questions and like trying to make me out to be a poser. I'm not saying it doesn't happen in real life, but I haven't experienced it so much in real life as I have on the internet.
Mm-hmm. It's probably not as common. There's a higher social cost to being confrontational like that in real life. And I think more people, especially in a lot of the alternative outsider subcultures where, you know, people are a little bit more hesitant to be like in your face and aggressive.
Yeah.
But it's easy to do that on the internet where you're kind of anonymized, you've dehumanized everyone around you. So I think that's part of why it's so much more common on the internet. The problem with that, of course, is it that the underlying impulse is common, it's just being hidden by this reticence in real life, or are people changing and just being dicks online? That's kind of the thing that is really the big question.
I don't feel like it's the people that are actually going into clubs who live in like pretty diverse areas where they're constantly interacting with people of multiple like socioeconomic like backgrounds. They're not really interacting with people of color. A lot of times they're like these people who've probably never really been out to a golf club, people who are not very social, people who don't have the approach of being near a golf club, and everything. Because I'm just saying that based on people who I know in real life, they don't act like that online or in person. When I'm out and about, like in an alternative or golf space, people are there to just dance and vibe and enjoy the music and like enjoy spending time with their friends or meeting new people, and just kind of like really enjoying being in a mostly golf alternative space.
Yeah.
Because in real life, once you leave the club scene, you have to deal with a lot of discrimination. You have to deal with a lot of microaggressions. You have to deal with a lot of ignorant people harassing you. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen in golf clubs, some more than others, but they tend to be more like self-regulating, like if somebody harasses you, they get kicked out. If they have a habit of harassing people multiple times they come, they get banned. It's pretty easy to spot people who are going to be assholes because they just kind of go against the grain, and it's kind of easier to single them out. And they kind of get outcasted in a way. Like people start talking, or people just start noticing, like, hey, stay away from those people over there, type of thing. So I feel like people are just so like they just want to enjoy being in that safe space so much that they're not really thinking about who has the most expensive clothes, who has the most followers on Instagram, who is popular on YouTube, who has like the nicest house, who has all of this expensive goth decor from Pinterest. Like, people aren't really thinking about that. They're just like, wow, this music is cool, or like the drinks, like the vibes, like the people. I'm just too busy enjoying the space that I'm in to go out of my way to be a hater. Like, that's the vibe that I've felt for the most part.
I can see that. Unfortunately, one thing that I've seen, since I am white and have been involved in the scene, is that a lot of people, when they're doing those microaggressions and things, they're not doing them to the person so much as with their friends. They're being catty. They see someone new who doesn't quite look right as a confidant on the inside. So amongst the insiders, there is a degree of talking shit about outsiders amongst ourselves, even if we aren't confronting those outsiders. So it might not be visible to you as an outsider, other than maybe that creepy crawly sensation of people staring at you and talking about you behind your back. But that does happen. And, I used to let it slide, but I now do try to address it and call it out when people, sidle up and go, oh, hey, look at that person over there. Like, what about them?
I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. I'm just saying that, like, a lot of times people, they may say things to their friends or people that are close to them, but they're not like walking up to people and telling them, oh my gosh, your makeup sucks, or that's not really goth, or you're wearing too much color, or, like, people haven't acted that way towards me in real life.
Right.
So much. But it is more so like on a hush hush, like a, ew, did you see what that girl's wearing? Oh my gosh, look at her shoes. They're so ugly. Oh my gosh. Like, it's that sort of thing that does happen. But like what I was saying is like the kind of hate that you receive on the internet versus the kind of hate that you receive in real life is completely different.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I haven't dealt with a lot of hate within the goth scene in real life. And a lot of times when people are calling me a slur or telling me that I'm not goth because I'm wearing color or because I am of color or both. It's on the internet.
I have a question actually for y'all with regards to IRL versus online violence. I have noticed in my community, and maybe it is just me, but in previous years, ensuring the safety of those in events was paramount. So as you were saying earlier, if people were creeps, right, Ellen, you get street justice, get out of here, kicked out of this scene. But in my experience, that ethos, which I would like to think is born of punk and common decency, is on the decline. And online, I find that the rules, as you had said earlier, don't apply in the same way, not just because of what you were saying, Trey, earlier about how people, feel that they're risking so much more in having an IRL confrontation, but like think about it from like a moderator's perspective, like where I'm coming from. Like if I see something in my own team, as I have, if I see racism and I confront it, I give people time, as I did, give myself to, and that other and other people, who lived through that racism, to I guess confront it and also heal. When I've called out people online, right? People in my own community whom would have been touched by that have been reticent to call it out with me. And I don't know how specific I can or should get, but there was somebody in my scene that had made a very racist remark about Latinx women. And I'm like, girl, you're collaborating with them.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you think about that. So when I called them out, I got a lot of people who were very timid and made me feel like, like football players that were told not to kneel. And all I could ask myself was, if not now, when? If not this way, then how? How do I speak up for myself? So long lead into that question, but do you feel that there has been a change in, I guess, the way that your communities deal with racism, with any sort of ism in general, with confrontation, given that we've been online for a fairly long time now? COVID.
What I've seen online has been that people are. So what happens is, especially when it's somebody prominent, like a DJ or someone, in a band, it's usually the first people to know are usually people of color or queer people. And what I have found in my interactions have been that a lot of times they are afraid to say anything because they're afraid of anything from ostracization to having to deal with a bombardment of people coming out to defend the person that's been brought to light as doing whatever it is, to fear of physical violence. And the problem, I think, is I don't see there are people that I know, but not enough of the white people in the scene and the cis people in the scene and the people that are privileged. Not enough of them will then stand up and also support the people that are dealing with that. I'm gonna mention Cloak and Dagger in a little bit. That's maybe one example, but I've seen a lot of this happen where it ends up coming down to marginalized people having to defend these spaces, and a lot of times they're just afraid to do it,
Well, I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't give a fuck. I tell people, you know what? I have legal counsel on tap. Go ahead, come at me. But yeah, I empathize with those things. I guess my question was more how has that dynamic changed? I hope in for the better.
Yeah, I think there are more people making change, but I think there's also a backlash that's happening because these movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Indigenous rights or Me Too, these things are getting unearthed. They're being unburied. They were ignored for so long and not really called out, and just kind of an open secret in the background. And now they're being called out, and people are very uncomfortable with that. And so there's a lot of people who are acting out and being edgy and
pooping their diapers.
Yeah. So there's the people that are, hating the SJWs who are trying to police everybody and the whole anti-cancel culture bullshit and all that stuff. But there's definitely a backlash to it. I think it's just I think we are going through a change moment here, and I think we are changing for the better, but there's always going to be a last gasp of the old guard as they try to reassert the status quo in very aggressive ways. And that's, I think, what we're seeing when it comes to maybe an uptick in some of the nastiness, especially in venues like online.
I feel like discrimination and like being oppressed kind of goes a little bit deeper than just like being alternative. If you're a person of color, it's not even just microaggressions. Like, you can get discriminated against from jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I have to be a completely different person for work in order to work, even though I'm not wearing like any kind of goth clothing, goth accessories, or anything to kind of like identify myself as a goth person. I still I can't really be myself at work. I can't really tell people what I'm interested in. I can't tell people what I'm really doing on the weekends. I don't like it when coworkers invite me out to things because that requires me to pretend to be normal, and I don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like it socially ostracizes you in completely different ways that a lot of people just don't talk about. There's people that I'm no longer friends with because they haven't accepted me for being goth or alternative. And you think that they would, because some of those people are also goth or alternative, and they, not all skin folk is kinfolk. Like, that applies to a lot of communities. A lot of people, as you get older, they change. They decide that they've grown out of it, or that it was a phase for them, or a way for them to cope with some type of traumatic event, and they've moved on, and they see you kind of interested in some of the same things and diving deeper into it, and now they kind of scoff at it. Like, oh, you're still doing that? Yeah, I've gotten that before. Or just I don't know, I've had problems with jobs before, being discriminated against. People will make up rules to make them apply specifically to you, rules that never existed before.
Yeah, a lot of times it's like a uneven application of whatever arbitrary, rule is in place, where they may cite you on something, but ignore, like you said, ignore the white person, not doing the exact same thing. I think
it's not even all the time a white person. It could just be a normal person.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm just saying. People have made up rules and make them apply specifically to me just because they didn't like the way that I looked. And it's it's not even a rule that existed before, but it exists now because I work here.
So I want to call out performative allies. I find that people are very keen to look at your community and say there's something wrong, right? And holler about it until it happens in their community. And what parallel I'm going to draw is on the previous anecdote that I just told you is okay, so everyone decided to discover Sonsombre. I know it's Sonsombre, but I'm going to call it Sonsombre because that is the gift that I had in my mind before everybody discovered that they were affiliated with some white supremacist group and all that, right? When people discovered that there had been a long period of time between figuring out that Brandon Pivas had been affiliated with these groups, and it hadn't called them out. There was there has been that dialogue
Mhm.
in the community, right, about that, like why would that happen, how could you let that happen, blah 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 blah. But like, what happens when it happens in your own backyard, right? You might want to hesitate for some of the reasons that you had said earlier, obviously, Danny, right? Like, maybe fear of retaliation, but why we do these things is like, if and especially if we're trying to preserve our own safety, it's very important to call out, and also to call out in turn that people are your allies until it happens in their own backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy to be an ally when it doesn't affect you personally, but when it's something that you like or something that you do that is all of a sudden getting critiqued, it's much harder to maintain that allyship.
I've definitely had white friends over the years kind of disappoint me in fake allyship. There are certain people that are just like, they're so like punk, they're so goth, they're so like liberal. But like when I started talking about issues that I was facing in terms of discrimination in the workforce, or like how like Black women can't wear our hair naturally because it's seen as unprofessional. And then like my white friends and they're to say to me like, well, I have to straighten my hair every day for work and I have curly hair. Like,
no,
that's not the same thing. You choose to straighten your hair because that's what you like to do. But if you showed up with curly hair to work, people will compliment you and say that you're so exotic and interesting. And they comment you how cute your hair is. Like, your loose white girl curly hair doesn't begin to compare to mine, and it's not the same thing at all.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I want to add is when like white friends of mine try to force that like white guilt, like always I hate being white, I hate all white people, I'm right there with you, and trying to get validation from us. We have to make them feel better about being white, and just always, one of my biggest things that irritates me is like I have this one friend, and whenever like we would go into public or something, they would kind of try to start those arguments that they know that I could speak on, that only I should be speaking on, just to try to get me to get in there, like speaking on Native issues or speaking on cultural appropriation, bringing it up to random people just so I can join in when I don't want to. I just don't want to argue with these people, but I just can't deal with the whole white guilt thing. Like, it's just overwhelming. I don't want to always have to reassure people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an issue with emotional labor and expectations of emotional labor from discriminated groups to coddle and to explain things to, or to assure us that we're okay, that we're a good person. That's an expectation that we place on the people we discriminate against, and that's unfair.
Yeah. I'm not your Mammy or your Maria. Sorry.
Yeah. It's almost like somebody's kind of like using like their scary dog to like sick on people that they don't like.
Right.
Or it's like, oh, look at me, I'm not racist, I have a Black friend. And then they tag you in some stuff, or like, hey, look at this awful thing that's happening to Black people. I'm going to tag all my Black friends.
Oh my goodness.
Outraged.
Yeah.
Like, what? This is traumatic. Why'd you tag me in this?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. That reminds me of like my cosmetology class. Like, I just want to sit there, mind my business, do some hair. But I have a lot of classmates who will bring up traumatic things because it's not traumatic to them because they're white, but they'll be like, oh yeah, you hear about that thing that's going on in Native communities? Oh yeah, just like all the murder people. Like, I'm trying to do hair, please. Like, you're bringing up this traumatic stuff to me and I'm just trying to sit here and do my work. Why are you trying to signal me into this conversation? Leave me alone.
There's a big problem with white people trying to center themselves in these conversations. And there's a great line in, weirdly, going back to that special Bo Burnham that I mentioned earlier before we were recording. he says something to the effect of, why do white people always insist on seeing every socio-political conflict through the lens of their own self-actualization? And I think that's, you know, what you're describing is that fake allyship where you're identity politicking these systemic issues in order to make yourself look good as a, you know, a white ally kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's weird because I'll have these interactions with complete strangers. Like, I'll just be in the grocery store and some random white person comes talk to me for crap.
Yeah.
Like, oh, did you hear about that thing happening in Ethiopia? Like,
okay.
Well, it's tokenism.
Or you become that person of mind. I cannot tell you how many times I've had people who have met me through like small events or even my classes or something, and I become that token native person in their mind that they'll come to me and expect me to explain traumatic things to them. Like I had a person in my class come to me and expect me to give them tons of information on native issues and what's going on, and like, oh, here, let me tell you about all my traumatic experiences. Here's my life story. Here, I'll give you free trauma. Like, it's just they don't think about how it's actually affecting us. Like, those problems are my problems. You're seeing it through a different lens. Like, you're coming to somebody who experiences these things and you expect me to just be able to freely give you this information without having feelings. Like, I'm a person.
Yeah, there's already resources available for people to read if they're actually interested. There's lots of Native scholars. There's lots of Latin scholars. There's lots of Black scholars. There's lots of people who have made it their lives of work to explain these things to people. There's all these books. There's all these TED Talks. There's all these YouTubes and TikToks and things where people are already like diving in deep on those conversations. And if you want to learn about those issues, then you can seek those people out and you can learn from them. But you don't have to tokenize the people of color in your life and demand labor.
But I guess it's too hard to use Google, right? You just have to go to that one Black person you know or that one Native person you know. Go bother them. It's too hard to Google, too much searching and scrolling.
Wait. But I gotta like put out the Miami thing. In a world where you, white person, are tokenized, what do? I'm serious. This is the real thing in Miami. So my best friend's white here, and actually white, like the Anglo-Saxon, I guess.
Actually white, yeah.
actually white, right? That's a new hashtag. And she has to learn Spanish. She in the goth scene, there are a lot of dales, a lot of cross-cultural references that you would miss if you didn't understand Spanish and some of Hispanic culture or Latinx culture. So how would you face that, Daniel Trey? Speaking of being tokenized and getting tokens for, social currency.
It's weird.
I've never been in that situation.
It's kind of like
go
I've
to
never
Miami.
been reimbursed.
Really, she's just inviting you to Miami at this point.
I'm just saying it's alien to me to be that other person, except when I go out and travel and then I say I'm never leaving Miami. Oh my God, I hate Miami, but I'm never leaving Miami because I don't want to be othered ever.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I've lived in lots of all white areas most of my life. It's been very frustrating. So that's always been me. Like, oh gosh. Okay, here's a funny story. In 6th grade, I went to this all-white school, and it was just me and my brother. And we were the only Mexicans. We're indigenous Mexican, and we were in history class, and they start talking about Mexico. And the teacher looks at me, and she goes, "Okay, Sienna, so what kind of food do you eat? Can you share your culture with us?" And she just made me take over class. She made me take over class and start teaching all the other students about my culture.
My God.
So I've always been like, oh, there's that one Native person, there's that one Mexican. Go ask them questions. They're the only one here.
That's so weird. Like she's a that one dog.
Wow.
Teach the class. Like, what?
No, I became a teacher.
Well, do we want to? I mean, we could talk about music. I think the question I had before talking about the band specifically was that the thing that seems to come up a lot these days around the concept of separating the art from the artist, and then also just kind of what responsibilities DJs and promoters in the scene have around these kinds of when these things come out, like Sonsombre and these other bands we're going to talk about, or if you have, is it like, I know people who listen to Death in June or Morrissey. How do you feel about that? I mean,
I never listened to that, so I never formed an attachment.
Mm-hmm.
But for musicians that I've formed an attachment to, like I grew up on Marilyn Manson.
Oh,
and then, all the stuff came up about him. And then I have people that I personally know who have their own horror stories about him and his band. And it's just like, I don't, like, it was hard to let go because it's like, it was such a huge part of growing up for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's led me to so many other music and musicians and connections with people. Mm-hmm. And I read his book in high school, despite it being mostly redacted and everything on in the library and stuff. I found him to be a very interesting person and inspirational and everything. But yeah, like that was hard to let go because that was like such a huge part of like my childhood. But for bands like Morrissey and like all these other new bands that are coming out being problematic, it's like, okay, well, I never really listened to them, so whatever. I'm not going to now. But when it comes to like people that like you grew up on and you have like good memories with their content and it's such an integral part of like your being, it's like so hard to let go.
Right. I'm in the same boat with you there. As I was saying way earlier, I listened to many alternative genres before getting into goth, and Marilyn Manson was definitely up there. Like, he was a huge idol of mine, and I still have stuff of his I have to throw out, and it's heartbreaking, but he's a monster. Everything he did, everything that came out is absolutely horrifying, and there's no way I would never want to support that ever in any shape or form. He shouldn't make any more money off of his music, or I just think he should be boycotted. I think I know it's hard because he was an idol for many, but it has to be done. Like, there's no way I could support those things, and I think other people that have turned out to be that awful as well should also be boycotted. They shouldn't be able to continue making money.
Yeah.
All right. As someone who's a promoter or who kind of walked into that space pre-pandemic, oh man, yeah, those are tough calls. But I think that they're calls that I've felt more empowered to make now than I did 10 years ago when I first started my page, because I was afraid of I didn't even think I had social currency. We've had this discussion, actually, you and I, Danny.
Yeah.
I didn't think I could. I didn't have that power, but I always did because I controlled that platform. And yet I let people trample all over my values and plays, I think, objectionable content, as well as promote bands that I would never, like Skull Fuck You.
Yeah.
Go die. And never, not even like musically, that stuff is garbage to me. No offense.
Yeah.
Sorry, not sorry, actually. But like, yeah, is there a responsibility to curate that content? Absolutely. And I think that my actions speak louder than words on this. Everybody's putting out their, what is it, Goths Against Fascism tag or whatever on their photos. But long before that, I've been combating that kind of racism in my own community and having backlash,
Yeah.
Like, what is it? Is it Gegan something Nazis?
Yeah.
Sisters Gegan Nazis?
Yeah.
Gagan Nazis. Oh, I don't know. Gegan.
I don't know. Yeah.
And then to the comments that Ellen and Sienna were saying about should we be, prioritizing perhaps other artists when they are so integral into the fabric of our like a narrative, right? I mean, that's on you. That's very personal.
Yeah.
But why would I listen to Death in June? Because it's a jam, man. Like, I'm not gonna lie. What is it? A couple of their songs, they're danceable. Do I think that nonetheless we have a responsibility as a culture to look at these things that people who have a lot of clout do, and call them out, examine them, and all that? Yeah, absolutely. We should be having those conversations. And I think that they can inform perhaps like whom we choose to listen to next, because let's be real. I think you put this in the show notes, and if not, we've had artists like Joy Division using fascist imagery in their albums.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody talks about that. What about Susie and her swastikas? What are you going to do about that? Yes, maybe the cultural context was different back then, but I'm not going to sit here and apologize for them. They're alive. They can do that themselves. They can be like The Cure. That's like, look, I'm not going to put up a song like Killing an Arab up right now because of the temperature.
Yeah. That does bring up the concept that's not really addressed in a lot of these discussions about what is the road to redemption? How do these individuals or bands who have a history of doing something bad, how do they prove an honest remorse? How do they come back? How do they redeem themselves? Because if there isn't a road to redemption, what impetus do they have to even change? Why should they even care about the outrage? If they've been tarred for life, well, I guess I'm tarred for life. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing. So there is a question of what is the road to redemption? How can you make amends for past problems?
I feel like when it comes to content creation, like music or YouTube videos, you could take those things down and not continue to profit from it. Like that's in the right direction.
Okay.
I also think like giving back to communities they hurt. I think that's a really big step as well.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I could send you heart emojis because I think that's so true, so real, man. Just give back to those that you're.
Right. But I get what you're saying too, Aimee, I think, so while I do think we should boycott people like Marilyn Manson, I understand sometimes like there are songs people want to dance to, with the Smiths and everything, but my main thing is do not let those people continue to profit when they're problematic. Like, you may like Death in June, but I just don't think you should give them any money. I understand their songs are danceable, but they need to understand that their actions and words have consequences.
I guess there's that delineation between the public and private space. And, and I guess in general, I think that after art is created, it's not the product of that person anymore. It belongs to the broader community, and it's also then subject to the context and of the individual and of the group if it's a public thing, and the sort of labels and interpretations that the audience places on it. And then it's also living and breathing. So, Joy Division using the Nazi drummer on their, whatever it was, like their first single or EP or something. The context of that at that time is going to change, and we have to kind of talk about that as it does, which is, so I don't think you can really make blanket statements about, I mean, the idea of the art, separating the art from the artist, I think is just a general way to avoid responsibility or self-reflection in general. Mm-hmm. But like everyone else said, I think we shouldn't be playing those songs or bands in clubs, especially when we can, replace that song with a different artist who's doing good things for the community. And I think that DJs should be making this information known, because then you won't have as many maybe well-meaning people inadvertently promoting bigoted individuals. Because what happens then is if people are going off and playing those bands at like house parties, for example, what that might do is make people of color who know about that artist feel uncomfortable and ostracized. But then it might also kind of inadvertently make fascists who know about that band feel comfortable. And we don't want to do that. So I think it's something, there's a responsibility there to make that information known. Yeah, which is why I wanted to talk about the couple bands. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that second part is the most important part, because just boycotting, just not playing, there's an element of burying your head in the sand there. It's not exposing a problem. It's just people who are in the know might know why, but other people are just like, all of a sudden this band isn't getting played anymore and I don't know anything about it. So nobody's learning anything, no one's discovering anything. So yeah, having rationales, having reasons why someone's being deplatformed or not being played, and having that out in the public is an important part of all of this, because that's how the community learns what is and is not acceptable within the community, and to a degree how the artist who's the one being boycotted maybe can find a road to redemption. If they're just all of a sudden being boycotted without any dialogue about it, it's hard for them to move on and maybe figure out how to redeem themselves too.
And I think, Sonsombre is maybe a case study in that, because part of, to sort of address your question about what is the road to redemption, like
not what Sonsombre did.
No, yeah, exactly. In the case of Sonsombre, you can go to their Facebook page and look at what they wrote, but it was just a non-apology that tried to ignore the issue completely, right? So, and so just to kind of if we were going to summarize that, what happened for anyone who doesn't know, and if you don't know Sonsombre, they were a pretty prominent band, and they were like producing albums for other artists and ending up on goth compilations and getting played in clubs and things. There were some conversations, like you said, Aimee, a couple years ago now, probably going around about them, about Brandon. But the Ashley Peel on her Instagram show Bloodstream, she put all this information together. Basically linking Brandon. Well, I guess initially he was caught having followed a bunch of far-right Facebook pages and was Facebook friends with some known racists. And then Ashley did the legwork to show that he's an active member of Sons of the Confederacy, which is a pro-Confederacy group that teaches a revisionist history around the Civil War, that tries to basically paint the enslavers of black people in a positive light. And I'll have links to like the sources for these things. I'm going to have a bunch of links in the show notes. Basically she linked him to having, being an active member. And then, he never denied membership. He never addressed the membership. He tried to downplay the whole thing and move on, which is the exact opposite of what should have happened. Tearful Moon was one of the other three that I was going to mention. That's another band that was playing they were playing shows with Rose Garden Funeral Party as recently as like 2019 and 2020. They were outed and then dropped by Young and Cold Records, which according to their post was for promoting Fall of the Cabal, which is a right-wing propaganda. And then for sharing QAnon conspiracy theories and anti-vaxxer propaganda. And I know Susie Sabotage wrote a post about their COVID-19 conspiracy theory, like fear mongering.
That is some tea. Wow.
Yeah.
First time I hear it.
And then the Drowning Season is another band who was playing shows in the local scene, but they were doing collaborations with bigger bands as well. And then also they ended up on like a pretty big goth compilation in 2019. And the problem here was, this is based off of the Facebook screenshots I've seen that went around at the time, maybe like a year ago. I don't remember exactly, but the guy behind the band had posted on Facebook saying that things like black people are loud, rude, and responsible for disproportionate levels of crime, saying things like it's okay to be white and promoting Trump and other things like that. And then the cloak and dagger was the last thing I wanted to mention, just because, bands are important, but the spaces that we all congregate in are also important. And the Cloak and Dagger at one point was was running nights in Chicago and using local goths to promote them. So I have like that secondhand kind of link to it, but I also know people involved at Cloak and Dagger in LA, but I'm only going to kind of mention there was this LA Times article published. So I'll mention what was in there because I'm not going to get into people's personal stuff, but basically the owners were accused of allowing and encouraging sexual misconduct against women, from employee to employee, and as a way to get celebrities to their club. And then the other issue was that black goths who went to the club had called out the owners for not saying anything about BLM at the time, after George Floyd was murdered, and they were instead like just promoting their club nights like nothing was going on. And then those black goths who went to the club were basically ignored, long story short, essentially. And so that was like that whole scene was kind of impacted by that as well. So
I just want to clarify.
It's not.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to clarify what I said earlier about, why would I listen to a particular band that has like problematic roots, right? Because as you said earlier, you do have to listen to our communities and how we deal with these things, right? But yes, definitely in shared public spaces, I don't want to be blaring out anything that, puts people in that kind of duress. And I think that that's important. I'm glad you called it out. As a community, we can do better, and we should.
And so, yeah, I mean, and I bring it up also just to point out, like, I bring up those bands also just to point out that it's a thing that happens now. It's not just, it's not just Boyd Rice and, stuff in the 80s. It's a thing we have to be vigilant about now. Even like And One, who I know they're not a goth band. I didn't have them on here, but although I've heard them played like a million times in clubs, and he went on a Twitter tirade with all these anti-vax conspiracy theories and QAnon conspiracy theories, and saying things like he wanted Trump to send a army to Germany to take out Angela Merkel or something like that. So it's like, this is the thing that happens, and we can't just kind of going back to the privilege thing. White goths need to recognize that, like, if you think our community isn't political, that means you have the privilege to be able to ignore all this stuff that's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens in my community where, like, again, being white isn't being white, actually white.
Mm-hmm.
We do have
hashtag.
we do have that privilege. But I argue that in having that privilege, we also have that responsibility. I'm sure you heard that coming.
Yeah.
To speak up when we can for those who cannot. If it's welcome, of course. Because I don't want to speak over people that do not want to be spoken over. Because that's also a problem that I experience. I will make a reference that is very cultural, or I have a sense of humor that's born and bred out of being, amongst so many Cuban Americans here who, make light of a lot of situations, but I'm not meaning to be mean about them, but just, because this is the way that they mourn, the way that they deal with like trauma or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I remember actually one of the first times we ever chatted, I was in I think like Gothamino or something, haha.
flashback.
I completely forgot that existed for a second.
I know. Me too. I want to forget it too. But there was a hurricane coming over here to Miami, right? That was 2017, I believe. And yeah, that shit is hella scary. But I lived through Andrew, and I survived, and that was a Cat 5. Now, when I said I'm gonna, take out like my finery, my Gothic finery, put out a black bath bomb and all that, and just relax and have a despojo, which nobody understood what a despojo was. I'm sure nobody bothered to look it up, right? Despojo. They said, "Oh man, you're making light of that situation," blah 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 blah, right? Oh my God. Thanks for putting your ethnocentric lens all over it.
Yeah.
But because despojo means I'm trying to, do like a purifying ritual to get a hurricane out of Miami's way, right? But this, definitely want to, make sure that I call that out. We need to let people speak for themselves in their own cultural contexts and the ways that they help them heal, however it is that they do it.
Yeah, exactly. So then, well, I guess we can maybe just transition to to close out here, since we've been going for a while, and just open it up to everyone else as of that question. What can we as a community do? How can we emphasize these issues, and especially, for white people, but how do we better recognize and address bigotry?
I think it's up to white people to call out other white people and not rely on the emotional label of people of color.
Yeah.
Because we've been saying the same things for literally centuries, and people don't listen to us.
Yeah.
Exactly. Use your voices to help uplift people of color and help us get the attention that we've been trying to get but have failed to do.
Call out your racist white friends, family members, coworkers.
Don't let things slide. It may seem insignificant to you, but it really does matter because it affects other people, even if it doesn't affect you.
If you have people in your life that are racist, sexist, or homophobic, transphobic, or are ignorant about Goth's alternative people, ableist, or whatever, don't bring people from those groups around those particular people, because you're putting them in danger.
That's the mic drop right there. This could be our lives. Those words you're thinking of not saying could be that crucial.
Yeah. The in-person action is so important, because you can post online and you can talk online about these issues, and it will have, I think, very little impact on your white friends. But it's that thing, speaking up in these club settings. I've heard people make these, again, just like you, Trey, I've heard people make sexist, ableist, homophobic jokes in club settings, in goth clubs. It's not like it doesn't happen there. And you need to speak up about that. We need to be open to being corrected when called out, instead of doing this reflexive defending of our actions. I think we talked about buying music from bands with people of color, asking our promoters to get those bands to come out and play on tour. I always link this website from Jane Elliott called, I think it's called A Commitment to Combat Racism, which is this list of yes or no questions that you can go through, but you can pick one and basically implement it in some practical way into your life as a white person and take immediate action. So I'll link that as well. I think that's good to read through. And then I think we can think about the ways that we operate as a community. Like we could do food drives or, food drop-offs at club events. We can get our friends together and volunteer for things. I know William Faith in Chicago runs a permaculture class, which kind of, goes back to less about racism, but this sort of class consciousness that is more uniting than dividing people. And yeah, it's, you know, it is the white dude at the club that makes that joke is going to be more open to being corrected by another white dude. And also it's on us as white people to do that labor, not the people that have to suffer from it, right? So
yeah. If you feel like uncomfortable or just, oh, you know, I don't want to get involved, and it tires you out to speak up, just think about how hurtful and bad it is for those it affects to hear those things. It may be annoying for you to try to call it out, but it's actually affecting and hurting somebody else that's listening. So don't let that stop you. You have to be involved. You have to do something about it. And also, I think that what we can do is make spaces need to be more inclusive and welcoming for people of color, because a lot of the times they can feel very scary or just cold. Like, there's been a lot of places I've gone where I did not feel welcome, and there was nothing inclusive. There was no diversity. And I think that needs to be pushed more, especially in the music, or just, we need to celebrate those things more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I was dreading that question. What can goths, and especially white goths, do better to recognize and address bigotry? Just like, I think your thoughts in summary are perfect, right? Like, that's not really up to me, man.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, in my community, it is, because I happen to be in that space that has a little bit of power. But
yeah.
So yeah, thank you for acknowledging that.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for taking your time to hang out. This was really wonderful because I love all of you, and this is really nice to get to spend some time together.
And if you guys want to come to Detroit, you're more than welcome.
I was going to say Detroit's not too far. Miami's a little harder, but
I know Detroit's kind of infamous, but I promise you there are some cool areas here and some cool things to check out.
Yeah, Detroit's infamous.
Are you near
like
Hell?
Chicago's infamous. So
Hell is a little farther out, but I've been there actually. I did makeup out there.
Nice.
I did some photo shoots up there a few years ago.
It's very boring. It lets people down. You know, you hear the name Hell and you go there and you're like, what is this? It lets people down.
All right. Well, thank you all again. I will release you into the night. So really briefly, before we get to suggestions, there was something I kind of mentioned in response to you at the beginning of the show that I didn't ever come back to, because it didn't really fit like with where the conversation was going. And I don't have like a huge thing to say about this, because it's just something I've been kind of thinking about, something I kind of recognized. But when we were talking about if goth is political, then what are the political values associated with that?
Yeah.
And a couple things that I identified around that when I was thinking of like, okay, so does goth embrace more of a left-leaning theory? And how pervasive would that be? What kind of theories would be related to that? I kind of kept coming back to neoliberalism, which is not leftist, but because there's this sort of, historically, there's been this idea of goth as a purely, a way to express yourself as a pure individual. That I think is really based in neoliberalism, because in like Marxism or leftist theory, that places an emphasis on the group, because it's about class struggles and working as a group to struggle against capitalism. And so that individualized expression is this sort of identity politics. So the criticism of that from a leftist perspective is that it puts the focus on personal responsibility and onto consumer identities, which serve to divide the working class against each other. And because like if you are rich, you're self-made and it was something you did by yourself. So then if you're poor, you have a personal responsibility to fix that. You know, we don't talk about how Black people are incarcerated at 7 times the rate for marijuana, or the way, like redlining, the ways that puts, you know, you into certain places.
Have been expressly forbidden from avenues of accumulating actual wealth.
Right.
They can make money, but they can't accumulate wealth because of issues with getting loans and buying property and owning businesses and all this stuff that they face innumerable hurdles that allow them to, or prevent them from accumulating generational wealth that they can then pass along and accumulate over the years.
Or with like another example is the accumulation of things. Whereas if a rich person has a whole bunch of stuff, it's, you know, it's like it's house goals. But if then on the other end of the spectrum, we have people who are hoarders, they're labeled as hoarders, who are usually poor or working class, and usually there's some mental illness or situational issues going on that are completely ignored, and it's the same personal responsibility. Like, it's, you know, whereas with the rich person who has a bunch of stuff, that's great, but the poor person who has a bunch of stuff, like, that's disgusting, and we make fun of them and ignore the situation. So that's this sort of reminds me of the way that those hierarchies and those individualized identities divide people. Reminds me of the way I hear Goths talk about their hatred or disdain of the big other, which is the phrase Lacan, the philosopher, would use, but basically, you know what I'm talking about. But the normies, the mainstream, this abstracted group of homogenized people that we define ourselves against. And that plays right into that division between the poor and the working class, rather than working together. We're fighting against each other, right? And then there's just the other kind of interesting ways that neoliberalism came up when I was doing research for this was in Victoriana and like Victorian colonialism and Gothic literature. Gothic literature has a lot of ties to neoliberalism that is usually baked into those stories, and that we use in our community, in our culture, but we don't talk about that context.
Yeah.
Gothic architecture, this was something I learned. We don't really talk about Gothic architecture on the show because it's not really relevant as much, but I mean, it's still like part of that aesthetic. The designs used in Gothic architecture were taken from places like the Middle East, like Syria, and from Muslim dynasties where crusaders stole the architectural concepts and then brought them back to Europe. So it's another product of imperialism, and you know, so I think that context is kind of relevant in sort of just thinking about what the systems we are acting within and reinforcing are. As Goths, we aren't in a vacuum immune from that system, you know. So that's what I wanted to bring up.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, and then again, to your point, I almost went off on a tangent about this, but as I'm not completely done with the book yet that we're doing for the next episode. But as many thoughts as I have about theory and of subculture and of goth and the way that they view it, and as much as we can talk about that, it was weird how much political action, or I guess praxis and like activism, played into that telling of the Italian Goths in the 80s. So I think some of that we can kind of discuss as well on the next episode.
Yeah, I mean, to a degree, it's an interesting counterpoint to the concept of goth being political, because it's not necessarily saying it's not, but it is saying that it's stepping back from the overwhelming activist base of the punk subculture. Right. So I can understand, given that, it's just like we were talking about, or like what I was mentioning with, the clapback against Me Too and all that. There's a degree where when you back away from something, sometimes you overcompensate and you become anti whatever it is that you really only truly want to back away from, but you demonize it to really divest yourself of it. And I think that's a problem. But it's an interesting counterpoint to the arguments of goth being political versus apolitical.
Right. I mean, there is more complexity to that, but I think what the punks were trying to avoid was something that we've talked about before on the show, and the idea of once your identity is part of the system, because they kind of talk about wanting to resist from within the system rather than living in squats and like making their whole lives about activism. You run the risk of your subculture being turned into like a consumer identity and then becoming a commodity, and that getting co-opted and kind of sold back to you, which I think we kind of actually saw with punk in Britain.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to get into it too much. I have a bunch of thoughts about that for the book. So, okay. So Sinister Suggestions, on a completely different note, actually, maybe I'll share some context that you already know, Trey, but is relevant to my suggestion that I haven't mentioned on the podcast. I am in the middle of, actually tomorrow, we will be watching The Two Towers with a friend of ours who has just read the books for the first time and are now going to be watching the Lord of the Rings movies for the first time with us, which has been a really special experience because I haven't watched those films in a long time, but they were really important to me. I have a lot of memories of seeing them in the theater, but then just like watching them on repeat and watching all the hours and hours of like extended bonus content on the DVD collection boxes and that kind of thing, and really being into like renting books from the Tolkien universe from the library at high school and that stuff. So that universe was really special to me. So it's nice to kind of revisit that. And along that line, since everyone listening to this is a podcast listener, sorry to tell you, I don't care if you're on YouTube. Haha, we tricked you. I this week became aware of a podcast, a new podcast with Billy Boyd and Dominic Monaghan, who played Pippin and Merry in the films. And it is called The Friendship Onion. And they're on like episode 6 or 7. I binged the entire thing in one day. Because it's so cute and it's so funny, and they're both such great storytellers, which I think is one of my biggest weaknesses as a podcaster. I feel like every other podcaster is so good at telling a story and like making you feel like you're in that moment of their life with them and experiencing it with them. So it's really fun to have that shared, because they do talk a lot about Lord of the Rings, but they also talk about just random things. And I've found, thankfully, that a lot of whenever like science or philosophy has come up in some way, I've more or less aligned with their viewpoint, because you never know when you start listening to a podcast with a couple white dudes if they're going to be like a Joe Rogan or something like terrible. Mm-hmm. And so they're so sweet and adorable. And so I want to recommend that. If you're interested in checking it out, I would start with episode 3, which has Elijah Wood on it. I thought that was a particularly good episode. But they also surprisingly talk repeatedly about League of Legends. And it's been really cute to hear them tell their stories of playing League of Legends together as well. So, video game connection was nice. So that's my suggestion.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds like it's a fun little show. I'll definitely have to check that out.
It kept my depression at bay for a whole day. It was great.
I'm sure it's got replay value, so you might get a couple more days to milk out of it too.
Oh, I love milking it, let me tell you.
I know. There's nothing like milking depression.
Shooting itself all over your... Yeah, okay.
Yep. All right. Well, I was struggling a little bit, so... I wasn't sure we were going to do a Sinister Suggestion, so I just was digging through my Spotify of stuff that I added recently, and stuff that I've kind of listened to and I'm trying to discover, since I'm trying to focus a little bit more on music lately. And I just was reminded and listened to part of it. I haven't finished it, but Danny Elfman came out with a new album, a solo album.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, he had collaborators, but it's it's the first Danny Elfman album that isn't a soundtrack or wasn't an Oingo Boingo album since 1984. So it's been a while for a solo album, but it's called Big Mess. It came out just June 11th, so just a couple weeks ago. And so far, I haven't listened to all of it. It's a 2-disc album, but I've enjoyed a lot of it so far. It's kind of got a harder rock mixed with orchestral vibe. So he's kind of merging some of his later era Oingo Boingo aesthetic with some of his movie soundtrack aesthetic. And overall, I'd say I've really enjoyed it. I think it's a really good album. And I do recommend, if you're a Danny Elfman fan, either from the Oingo Boingo days or from more of his soundtrack work, check it out.
That's another great nostalgia blast as well. Because I haven't really thought about Danny Elfman for a long time, but yeah, I'm definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a pretty big fan, so I listen to Danny Elfman pretty frequently, and I've listened to most of his soundtracks. I really enjoy them. I like his aesthetic a lot, even if I haven't seen all the movies. Your little nostalgia trip about Lord of the Rings reminded me I should go back and watch the old Rankin Bass Return of the King movie, which is my childhood memory of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yeah, it's the same people who did the Hobbit cartoon.
Yeah, I have.
They only did the Return of the King from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Ralph Bakshi did the Fellowship of the Ring in a totally different style that I never really got into. I'm not a big Ralph Bakshi fan, though it's interesting. And both of those, between the two of them, you can kind of get the whole trilogy. There's a big gap in Two Towers that isn't done because, the Ralph Bakshi Fellowship goes into Two Towers a little bit. And the Return of the King one starts a little bit in Two Towers, but the whole thing about Rohan and the Rohirrim is just gone in general in both of them, except a little bit where they pop up in the battle for Gondor.
As I mentioned, next month we will be coming back with a book discussion. The last time we did this was on The Evolution of Goth by Carl Sprecklin, and this time we're going to be looking at the book Italian Goth Subculture, Kindred Creatures and Other Enactments, which covers the goth and broader subcultural negotiations and enactments in mostly Milan, but Italy in the 80s. There's a lot of interesting content there and a lot of interesting ways that relates to the way we experience goth subculture today. So I'm really excited to do that episode. If you enjoy the content we make and you're interested in supporting us on Patreon, or you just want to see what kind of rewards you can get, like merch, Discord access, access to our movie commentary tracks that we've been doing recently. We just did the movie called Goth, which was a disaster. But if you want to get access to that kind of thing, head over to patreon.com/Cemetery Confessions, where you can join our community for $1 a month is the smallest amount. And of course, every single one of you matters, and keep the show on the air. Keep these episodes coming out every month. Also, like I mentioned, this was a pretty dense episode. We covered a lot of ground, but also in some ways only kind of scratched the surface on a lot of these issues. And I think we could have picked any individual topic that came up and done a vertical dive into that specific subject. So I have a large volume of links in our show notes under resources. So whether you're on YouTube or the website would be immediately the most up-to-date place to check, which is thebelfry.rip/Cemetery Confessions. Otherwise, every other place should have these links in there. But you can kind of peruse and look through both content we referenced during the episode, and also just further reading, further viewing. There's YouTube videos, articles, and other things that will add a broader contextual element to the episode itself. So thank you all again so much for spending time with us. I really look forward to sharing time with you each month. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.